Ruth chapter 2. Now Ruth is now a believer, and she's in the land of Israel. So how would she act? Since Moabites were excluded from the congregation of Israel, that's from Deuteronomy 23:3, she was there by grace. The events in chapter 2 will show how she was received. Now in this chapter we meet another person, Boaz, a wealthy farmer. So would he be a responsible member of the godly congregation of Israel? We find that Naomi is now home. Would her grief fade and her depression heal? By their words and their actions, the three main characters in this story will reveal their true characters. Now, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelek, whose name was Boaz. So Boaz is a near relative of Elimelek, Naomi's deceased husband. And Boaz was a man of outstanding qualities. The Hebrew words translated in the NIV as man of standing is more literally a mighty man of valor. They're the same words used of Gideon and Jephthah from Judges 6 and Judges 11, respectively, each of whom was called a mighty warrior. And they were men of valor, capable, efficient, and worthy in battle. Boaz was a mighty man of valor also. He was capable in his community, and he lived an exemplary lifestyle. As a wealthy relative, Boaz was a source of possible help for Naomi and Ruth. If he chose to do so, he could stand up for their rights and make sure they were cared for. In fact, Israelites were required to care for widows and orphans. I earlier quoted some verses from Exodus 22 about this. Often, though, this was not done. Greed and selfishness would take precedent over God's laws. This was just one reason Israel was always getting into hot water with God. They weren't helping the poor the way they were instructed to. So Naomi would have been very, very uncertain whether Boaz would be any help to them at all. Now verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So remember that this was the time of the barley harvest. Ruth's plan is to find a field on which the barley has just been harvested. She would then pick up any grain left behind. Now this is not thievery. There's a provision in God's law that allows for this. From Deuteronomy 24, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it there for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go back over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. And then also we have Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So it was allowed for the poor and the destitute to follow behind the harvesters in the field, picking up the leftover grain. This provided for the poor, but it also required them to work hard for their provision. It therefore preserved a sense of dignity for the poor. They were not just blindly dependent on someone else's generosity, but were still self-sufficient to a large degree. God's wisdom is apparent even in his generosity. It's also important to note in verse 2 that Ruth took the initiative. A stranger in a land in which she would have been afraid she wouldn't have been accepted, she still immediately went out among the people to find a way to serve Naomi. What adds to her courage here isn't just her ethnic origin, but she also probably realized that landowners didn't always obey the law, that greed would often trump generosity. Ruth knew a landowner or his servants might very well kick her off the field, or perhaps even rape her. Sadly, in ancient times, without a male protector, women were in constant and very immediate danger of sexual abuse. In verse 3, so she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelek. The Hebrew translated in the NIV as it turned out, talks about Ruth's apparently random choice of what field she worked in. But Hebrew theology attributes everything that happens to the activity of an ever-present and all-powerful God. So for the original Hebrew readers of this book, there's no difficulty in identifying God being in control of this. Where the original language translates as it turns out, the subtext is always, God did this. So Ruth had moved forward in obedience to her rights and the laws of God. Because of this, she was guided by grace into the place God provided. The same providence that would lead the Magi to Bethlehem in Matthew chapter 2 directed Ruth to the appropriate Bethlehem field. There are no coincidences. God is at work in everything. The verse also stated once again that Boaz was from the clan of Elimelek. This fact is important to the unfolding events. So in verse 4, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. So Boaz shows up after Ruth had been working in the field for a while. The greeting he exchanges with his workers is the standard one of the day. It's equivalent to people saying hi or hello to each other today, though it does include a much more overt acknowledgement that God is the source of our blessings. So why did the author of this book toss in such a superficial detail? And that's because it's not superficial at all. In these two brief sentences, we get a firm sense of the mutual respect felt by Boaz and the men he employed. It's the sort of rapport here that only exists when your boss is a nice guy and a fair man. So when Boaz reacts with generosity to Ruth over the next few verses, we believe it. Elements like this, little things that effectively bring personalities to life, are peppered throughout the historical books of the Bible, and they help confirm that they are true stories, that these are the accounts of real people. The grasp of human nature in the Bible, both the good and the bad, are always presented in a believable and completely relatable manner. Now verse 5, Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" Now, notice that Boaz asks who she is by asking who she belonged to. In other words, what family was she a part of? As I mentioned, living in the ancient Near East, outside of a family, especially for a woman, was very, very dangerous. And since Boaz does not recognize Ruth, he's sufficiently concerned to inquire about her background. It's actually a way of asking, is she safe? Is she protected from danger? Verse 6 and 7. The overseer replied, She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now, I like this overseer. I really do. He acknowledges that Ruth isn't Jewish, but there's nothing derogatory in how he says it. He points out that she asked permission to glean in the field and that she's been working hard. God's grace is still at work. He brought Ruth not just to the field of a relative, but made sure that a good and fair-minded man was there when she arrived. So now Boaz knows who Ruth is and that she's a relative by marriage. We know from what he'll say a few verses from now that he had already heard reports about Ruth and Naomi. It's not a surprising thing in a small town. She's also been clearly identified to him as a Moabite, so if he didn't know that before, he does now. Now, Boaz might have reacted badly to Ruth's nationality. After all, the Moabites were pagans and enemies of Israel. But we're about to see another indication that Boaz is a godly man and an all-around cool guy. It's likely that he had surmised that since Ruth accompanied Naomi back to Israel, she had probably adopted the worship of the one true God. So Boaz knows this takes precedent over her ethnic origin. He knows God's love is there for anyone who wants to accept it. Boaz knew God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 about making Abraham's descendants a great nation was part of a plan to bring the whole world to God. A few hundred years after Boaz lived, Isaiah in chapter 42 of his book would write, "I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles." So Boaz already had a good grasp of this concept. Verses 8 and 9, so Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along behind the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and drink from the water jars the men have filled." So Boaz speaks to Ruth with courtesy and affection. Boaz uses the phrase "my daughter," likely reflecting an age difference between him and Ruth. He's likely closer in age to Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelek. It's also a very affectionate term to use for a foreigner. So Boaz immediately sees to Ruth's needs and to her physical protection. He knows his guys won't hurt her. Even if he's not sure of every single worker, I'm convinced he's trusted his overseer to keep everyone else in line. She can also keep company with the women servants so she can make friends and keep loneliness at bay. Also, Boaz apparently realized that being around other females was a way of letting Ruth know she really was safe while she was on his property. He established himself as her protector and made sure she knows that she was protected. He's thinking of her emotional security as well as her physical safety. He makes sure she knows she can have all the water she needs while she's working in the heat of the day. In other words, she's to have the same amenities as the workers belonging to the household. It's a very meaningful act of generosity. He didn't just slip her some money and tell her to go buy some food and hope she would go away. He saw to her safety and treated her with kindness and dignity. And this hospitality is practiced in a public setting where he, the owner of the field, exercises considerable influence and authority. His words and actions function as an important moral witness for others to see. Now, verse 10. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" So, Ruth was not wrong in bowing down before Boaz, by the way. Falling down or bowing before another person was a common ancient gesture of respect, honor, gratitude, or submission. The Bible condemns the offering of worship to any being, whether human or angelic, other than God. But gestures of respect in normal interpersonal relationships are not worship. Now, Ruth here wonders why she, a Gentile, is receiving such generosity from a Jew. This demonstrates her extraordinary humility. Now, Ruth had made great sacrifices to stay with Naomi and to care for her. Now she reacts to an act of generosity and courtesy by bowing down to Boaz and to show him respect and humility. She's not expecting any reward for what she's done. She's acted as she did simply because she loved her mother-in-law and wanted to help her. She acted as she did simply because it was the right thing to do. The hard work and the hunger did not leave her bitter or feeling as if God or society or the world owed her something. She remained humble. Humility is something that is gained and practiced when we grow in wisdom and grace. From Psalm 149, "For the Lord takes pleasure in his people, he adorns the humble with salvation." Or verses 11 and 12. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So we see right off that Boaz probably is already attracted to Ruth. But it's not because she's young and beautiful. He respects and admires her because of her loyalty and love for Naomi. He recognizes that Ruth is a generous and kind person who places the needs of others above herself. So Boaz prays that God reward and protect Ruth. It's interesting to wonder if Boaz knew how completely God would use him to answer that prayer. So just be careful when you pray for God to help others in need. He might very well answer by telling you to get with it. Now, Boaz is reflecting several Christ-like virtues here. He's compassionate to a stranger who has no claim on his favors. He knew all about Ruth even before she met him, just as the Lord knows all about us even before we come to know him. As we'll soon see, he served Ruth graciously, and all her needs were satisfied, just as Christ will satisfy our needs. He granted her protection and prosperity for the future. In these acts of grace, we see a foreshadowing of Christ's mercies to us. Now, verse 13. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servants, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." So, though Boaz's words could have stirred her to pride, Ruth continues to respond in humility, behaving with dignity and respect to Boaz without appearing servile or ingratiating. Naomi has given no words of encouragement to Ruth, but this man spoke comforting words to her that really undoubtedly warmed her soul. So we learn from Ruth's humility, but we also learn from Boaz's encouragement. From 1 Thessalonians 5, "Therefore encourage one another and build up each other, just as in fact you are doing." From Hebrews 3, "But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness." So God expects us to encourage one another, not to build up our pride, but to keep each other on a godly path. God makes us responsible for one another, requiring that we act with kindness, that we pray for each other, and that we encourage each other. Verses 14 through 16. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her. So Boaz continues to act with kindness towards Ruth. He invites her to share the good food provided for himself and his workers. This is a sign of friendship and acceptance. Now, it's apparent that Ruth didn't linger over the meal, though, as she's soon back working in the field again. So Boaz goes above and beyond what the law requires of him. Not only does he allow Ruth to glean among the sheaves, he also instructs his workers to just leave bundles of grain behind for her. He's making extra sure that she has a productive day. Verse 17, so Ruth gleaned in the fields until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. So that's about 30 to 50 pounds of grain. That's at least a 2-week supply for 2 women. So it was a good day's work for Ruth. Verse 18, she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave what she had left over after she had eaten enough. So Ruth not only brought all the grain home, she also saved part of the meal Boaz had given her to share with Naomi. Verses 19 and 20. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." And he added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." So now, to fully understand the events that follow, we have to know what a guardian redeemer is. In many Bibles, this is translated as kinsman redeemer. Now, under Mosaic law, an Israelite suffering from extreme poverty could sell himself, his family, or his land. From Leviticus 25, the land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. So the nearest relative, the kinsman redeemer, was provided to protect the man and his family. This also made sure that God's provision of Israel was respected by keeping land given to one tribe as a part of that tribe. It's a reminder that everything we have actually belongs to God, that we hold it in trust to use it to do God's work. Israel was expected to keep tribal boundaries intact because God had made those boundaries, and it was his land, so no one could change things around. The purpose behind this law holds true today. Our homes and our savings and all our stuff actually belongs to God and should be used in his service. So, if I were in the tribe of Judah and I was dirt poor, I might sell my land to a guy from the tribe of Simeon. I might also sell myself, becoming a servant to the other guy for a time. But my kinsman redeemer, my closest relative, would have first option to buy any land being sold, thus allowing it to be kept within the clan. So my land would continue to be a part of Judah. Leviticus 25 also explains that if no one is available to redeem me, and I wasn't able to save up and redeem myself, there was a year of Jubilee every 50 years, in which everything would be returned to me regardless. So no Israelite was able to take permanent advantage of one of his poorer brothers, and God's provision for the tribes and for the families would be respected. So, like all Old Testament laws, this has a relation to Jesus, who would eventually redeem us from sin, from Hebrews chapter 2. Both the one who makes man holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. In other words, Jesus is our brother and our kinsman redeemer, redeeming us from sin. So, as a relative to Ruth and Naomi, Boaz was in a position to take care of them and keep whatever land that belonged to Naomi's late husband within the family. Now in verse 20, Naomi had also said, he has not stopped showing us kindness. And it's actually not completely clear if she's referring to God or Boaz when he says he. But in this case, it really doesn't matter. God uses Boaz's act of kindness to encourage her, to make her aware that God is still there for her. So Boaz has embodied features of God's own character, particularly his kindness. This allows God to work through him to encourage and bless both Ruth and Naomi. So thus we see that Naomi, who had been feeling depressed and bitter, is really picking up. Hey, look at this. God hasn't forgotten me. He can bless both the living and the dead. Now, Naomi here means that Elimelek, her dead husband, could live on through her faithful daughter-in-law, Ruth. Now, verse 21, then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all the grain. So all the grain means she was being invited to gather food at his field through the barley harvest and then through the wheat harvest that would follow. Since Boaz had gone to great lengths to ensure Ruth's safety while she was in his fields, this tells Naomi two things. First, Boaz is obviously going to make sure they have sufficient food on a long-term basis. Second, Ruth's safety would continue to be guaranteed. Verse 22 and 23, Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So this last verse actually covers several months. Ruth and Boaz have time to really get to know each other. So there's no fairy tale love at first sight nonsense going on here. The two of them have had really good first impressions, but they end up with a lasting relationship that grows as they have time to learn more about each other. But all that begins with Naomi's very prudent counsel to stay in the fields of Boaz. Since he had shown himself gracious, why should Ruth insult him or spurn his protection by going into another's field? If she did go somewhere else, she might not only run the risk of being abused, but she might displease Boaz by seeming indifferent to his generosity. Naomi and her family had unwisely wandered away from God once, and she had learned her lesson from this. When God is providing for you, you don't wander away from the provision. Don't turn away from the protection and salvation that God gives you. Though, of course, when we do stray, we can always come back to God, just as Naomi had come back to Israel. In Matthew 18, what do you think? If a man owes 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish. So Elimelek and his family had wandered away from God by moving to a godless country, rather than trusting in God's provision. They were the sheep that had wandered away, but God had not forgotten them. They were lost sheep, but now Naomi is home again with a new child of God alongside her. That is God's kindness, mercy, and generosity at work. We may wander away, but he will always come looking for us. That is the end of chapter 2. The video with chapter 3 should be posting soon.